I'd like to talk to you about the impossible turn. But first I'm going to tell you my biases so you know where I'm coming from. I'll try to just give you the facts in the actual presentation to the best of my ability, but I have a definite bias about this particular issue. And it's a general bias, so I just want to say really quickly, what you don't know can hurt you in flying. And so, philosophically, I think a safe pilot needs to learn a lot of things, particularly a private pilot, needs to learn a lot of things that the FAA does not require you to know to be a good safe pilot. And some of those things are a 60-degree bank turn. Nowadays, we only have to teach a 45-degree bank turn. We used to have to teach a 60-degree bank turn, and there was a really good reason for that, is because a 60-degree bank turn generates strong sensations in your body that if you haven't become used to that, and you find yourself accidentally in a 60-degree bank turn, which can happen, you can respond to it improperly. And so you should know how to do those. You should know how to recover from a spin. If you've just seen one or two spins in your life, it's an eye-opener. And every private pilot should be exposed to that, just to see it, have it demonstrated so they can see, because it can be very disorienting. When the airplane rolls over and goes slightly inverted, everything looks weird. And it's nice to have seen that. It's also nice to see how easy it can be to recover from one. And so that used to also be a requirement. It's no longer a requirement in the United States. It's still a requirement in Canada to get spin training as a private pilot. You need to know how to scud run. Now, if there were CFIs here, I'd probably get castigated for saying that. But the fact of the matter is that it'd be hard to find a private pilot that flies much cross-country that hasn't had to, on one occasion or another, do a little scud running. And scud running, do you guys know what I mean by that? Most everybody. Scud running is when you've got low clouds and low visibility. And it's not out here in the Southwest, we generally have great visibility and high clouds. But in the Midwest and on the East Coast, it's really common to have low clouds and low visibility. I'm not recommending scud running. I just think that you need to be exposed to it and you need to know the pitfalls. I think you need to know how to prop an engine. Start the engine by pulling the propeller through. Because I can guarantee you, if your starter doesn't work one day, you'll be highly motivated to try to get that airplane going. And if you haven't ever props and understand how to do it properly and safely, you can get into trouble. I think everybody should learn how to roll and loop an airplane. Those are two fairly simple maneuvers, but the fact of the matter is that normally we operate in roll plus or minus 60 degrees of roll, plus or minus 30 degrees of pitch. Well, there's a whole lot of universe out there in airplanes that we don't operate in. And in particular, I've seen people do this, I've seen experienced people do this, and I've seen youngsters do this, where they try to do a roll. How they try to do a roll and don't know how to do it, and fall out of the roll and invert it, and then try to pull out in a very high G maneuver, a split S. So you should get some exposure to that. Go to an upset train class or something like that. Okay, and the last thing is, not the last thing, but another thing that I think you need to know about how to do is a turn back to the runway. And so I think I already made this point. These things are really important, not because you're going to do them regularly, or you may never do them, but you should understand the pitfalls associated with them, so that you can avoid them, learn how to avoid them, or learn how to do them. Now, having said all that, I want to say one other thing. I don't know how many people have heard this saying: altitude is money in the bank. Airspeed is money in your pocket. Have you guys heard this before? It's one of the best sayings I ever heard. And that's that airspeed gives you the immediate ability to maneuver or convert it to altitude. Altitude gives you the ability to get airspeed, but it takes a while. You've got to point the nose down, you'll let the airplane accelerate. So if you're in a situation where you need to maneuver quickly, it's nice to have some extra airspeed. It's always nice to have extra altitude, right? But it's nice to have extra airspeed. And I always thought this was good. You know, if you're out shopping, it's nice to have the money in your pocket, right? That's the airspeed. And if you're thinking about a big purchase, it's nice to have money in the bank. So, nothing else. Try to remember that one. Okay. What is the impossible turn? It's a turn back to the runway following an engine failure and with insufficient altitude and or insufficient pilot skill that likely will result in a crash. So there's been a big controversy about this. And anytime you have a big controversy between experts, CFIs and safety people and everything else, it's because they haven't completely understood the problem. And so my goal here was to try to understand the problem a little bit better. And so there's a lot of experts, very well qualified experts that say you should never turn back to the runway. And you should always go straight ahead on takeoff if you have an engine failure. And then there's others that say if you've learned to maneuver and you practice it, then you should be able to do it. And I believe that knowledge is power, skill is learned, and experience improves judgment. So get the facts, not the opinion. So that's what I'm trying to do, is give you some facts today. Okay, is it impossible to safely turn back to a runway? Well, sometimes it is. The most common cause of a fatality when turning back to the runway is a stall spin accident, and those are usually fatal, almost always fatal. Recently, there was an accident in Georgia with a CFI and a student. They were taking off from a local airport there, and the engine failed shortly after takeoff. The straight-ahead options were not good, and so they were taking off. They were taking off on this runway right here, and the engine failed about right here. And if you went straight ahead, you were going to probably hit something hard, because they had enough altitude. There was no way for them to get down before they exited the airport proper. And there's buildings and houses and cars and everything else out there. So they tried to turn back to the runway and they crashed. But importantly, they did not spin the aircraft. They stalled it in the crash right as they were going on the ground, but they didn't spin it. And they both survived. The student with minor injuries and the CFI with moderate injuries. So I'm going to show you that crash.
DeKalb County officials say a pilot and a student were on board that plane when they suffered engine problems during a training session. In this exclusive video, you can see the small Piper 28 take off, then make a left-hand turn before quickly descending and slamming into the ground.
In this event, having that occur so close to the ground is lucky to walk away from.
Witnesses nearby saw the whole thing.
And it looked like he was trying to come back around and find a soft landing, and he lost control of the plane.
What we call the turn that would be made here is referred to in aviation as the impossible turn, meaning that pilots who have lost an engine very shortly after liftoff and attempted to return to the runway have a very low success rate of doing that maneuver effectively and walking away from the maneuver. Unfortunately, with insufficient altitude, the lift that we use to keep the airplane in the air physically has to be used to turn the aircraft as well. So that would result in a loss of vertical lift, which is why you see the increased sink rate, as we refer to, or the rate as which the aircraft is approaching the ground occur. And unfortunately, that sink rate was not arrested soon enough before ground contact was made at a high rate of descent.
Flight instructor Hampton McDonald says when engine troubles occur shortly after takeoff, pilots have a tough decision.
Okay, so that was
He almost made it.
he almost made it, and the amazing thing is that he was only about 200 feet above the ground when he did this. Now, the other thing was he had about a 15-knot headwind on takeoff. So a headwind allows you to climb at a steeper angle, right? And it can reduce the turn radius. When you come back, I'll explain that a little bit more. So he had a couple things working for him. But here's the good news, right? They both survived, and they crashed on an airport with immediate services available to help them. instead of crashing in a parking lot somewhere. And so, something to think about. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to show you another one. It is possible to turn back. Is it possible to turn back to a runway? And sometimes it is. An experienced pilot in Indiana had a catastrophic engine failure on takeoff. He turned back to the airport and safely landed on the runway. So I'm going to show you this one. It was a Mooney. It was a Mooney aircraft, which actually can be a little more challenging than it is in a Taylorcraft or a Pegasus Air. Notice the stall horn went off almost immediately with the engine failure. So you notice he's very close to stall as he's making this turn, but the stall warning is keeping him from stalling the airplane. And his heart rate's probably about 140 right now.
He's doing a good job controlling his breathing. Not on the center line?
And you notice he landed long. Almost, and of course the prop stops because the engine's yeah, so he had crossing runways there. He actually turned back. When you watch this a couple times, you can see he actually turned back on the runway he took off on.
Yeah.
But he had another option, right? He could have gone the other way, and that's something to keep in mind. Also, see all the snow, right? So this was a very cold day, and that your performance improves quite a bit on a cold day. So
Yeah, it's low altitude too.
manage low altitude. Okay, so I've showed you one where they crashed. They didn't spin, but they crashed. And I showed you one where they made a successful turn back. So I'll talk a little bit more about it. One of the problems with this is if you go into the accident database, you can't really get a lot of good information because the ones where people are killed or crashed in a public area, or I mean at a big airport or something like that, they get investigated by the NTSB. But the successful ones you never hardly ever hear about. So there's no way to find a balance. All you hear is that it's an impossible turn. So I was looking for some data, and so there was a study done at the U.S. Naval Academy dealing with this particular issue. And what they did basically was they took 20 different pilots, ranging from a student pilot up to CFIs and military pilots, very highly trained pilots, and they had them fly various scenarios. A total of 147 flights between the 20 pilots, and they give them different scenarios to work with. So the first scenario was you're getting in this airplane.
Copy, class 157B, lifting departing from the north ramp, crossing 92.
You're getting in this airplane. There's going to be an emergency at some point, and after you climb and maintain 3,000 feet. And then they had the emergency occur at 500 feet. So the pilots were not expecting it to happen. A successful landing was any landing that was made where your wings were level, below 100 feet, and your impact velocity, vertical impact velocity, was 500 feet per minute or less. So it doesn't take into account obstacles, you know, like running into obstacles. So when I talk to you about the success rate for straight ahead, it doesn't tell you what's straight ahead, what you might have hit, right? We know if you turn back to a runway and you make it, there's not obstacles on the runway. But if you go straight ahead, you may have a beautiful field that's no problem you can land in, or you may have what that first pilot had, which was, you know, a very dense populated area. So on the first scenario, where they were given no advice about what to do and it was a surprise, they had three of the 20 pilots turned back, and only one of them made it back to the runway. The rest of the pilots went straight ahead, and they all met the criteria for a successful one. They were 100% successful. On the second one, they told them ahead of time there's a likelihood of an engine failure, and the guidance was simply to do a 180-degree turn back. Nothing other than that. If your engine's going to fail, we recommend you do a 180-degree turn back. There was a 45% success rate in this particular instance, and since they were told to turn back, nobody went straight ahead. So slightly less than half of them met the criteria for landing safely back on the airport. So then they did another one, and they gave them a little more guidance, and they said, we want you to do a 45-degree bank turn when you do the 180 back. And in that particular case, they had a 75% success ratio. So with guidance, as the guidance gets more refined, the success ratio is going up. And finally, they said, we want you to turn back. We want you to do a 180-degree turn back. We want you to do a 30-degree bank instead of a 45-degree bank, so a shallower bank. And they had a 100% success ratio with that. Yeah, so and you'll hear some people will recommend to do a 30-degree turn back instead of a 45 for this. There's pros and cons to that. The 45-degree bank gives you a tighter turn radius, but it also gives you a higher descent rate in the turn, which can be disturbing if you haven't seen it before. So there's two factors going on here. One is, so these pilots did these progressively, right? So they were practicing essentially as they went along. So naturally you would expect some improvement. But also it's interesting how much the guidance made a difference. So training and guidance are key things. Here's another data point for us. And Dan, your training is more recent than mine, so feel free to jump in here. Dan just got his glider pilot's license. If you're an applicant for a certificate as a glider pilot, you're required to demonstrate a turn back to the runway, and you're required to demonstrate it at altitudes as low as 200 feet. And below 200 feet, the guidance says go straight ahead. Above 200 feet, turn back to the runway, and you can either make a direct turn and land opposite your takeoff direction, or if you're even higher, you can enter a pattern and come in. And sailplanes have a distinct advantage because they have such excellent glide ratios. So in this particular case, I'm going to tell you that. You're also required to practice these periodically, typically once a year when you go out for a flight review or out with an instructor. You try a simulated tow rope break where you release the aircraft on a climb out. I did look this up in the NTSB. I found 3 accidents associated with practicing this. Well, they weren't all associated with the practicing. In a couple cases, they were actually rope tow breaks. Of that, one was fatal. It was a stall spin accident from about 200 feet. The other 2 resulted in no injuries, and they landed back on the runway. There are about 25,000 glider pilots in this country. I don't know how many hours they fly or how many flights they fly, but one fatality out of that number of glider pilots tells you that with training, and they're trained to do this, with training and the right equipment, this is a maneuver you can do quite successfully.
So, comment, in standard protocol on glider, you're taught these call-outs. So, for example, where I trained, if the rope break happened in a certain place, it's an immediate left turn over this fence, and there's a field you can crash in. You know, typically with power, most power people say they will do something like oil pressure, airspeed alive, and that's the end of their call-outs. And so then they think, oh, I'm flying. Where, and I just resurrected a 172 that hadn't flown in about 15 years. So I was in this mode of being nervous about engine out or rope break anyway. And so I recommend to people, that, especially flying out here, you develop your call-outs all the way to the Y, because there's a bunch of options that are going to go away and appear to you literally every 10 seconds when you take off out of here. It's a completely different scenario, what your options are and what your capabilities are going to be on the plane. So audio call-outs to me are just vital to keep your situational awareness high during this sort of 2 minutes of most critical phase of flight.
That's an excellent point. Excellent point. So I'm going to show you the simulated one so you can see it here. So this is a Grove 103 twin two-place glider. It's not a super high performance glider, but it's not bad. It's a 36:1 glide ratio, and it does that at 60 knots. It's really important, I'm going to emphasize this here and farther on, that you know for your aircraft what its glide ratio is and what its best glide speed is. Super important, because then you can pretty well figure out whether you can make a turn back or not.
Finally back flying at Nephi with my friend John Gantier. John, how you doing?
I'm good, good.
Have I scared you too much so far?
No, not at all.
This is my
you have to clean my shorts.
This is my spring checkout, and it's been great. So we've already done 2 tows. This is going to be a short flight because we're going to be doing a rope break practice. So John's going to pull the release on me somewhere above 200 feet. And I've got to come back and safely land it. So this is an emergency procedure that if we do it wrong, turns into an emergency really quick. Is that pretty accurate, John?
Yep.
Well, we're going to do it right. So there's a pretty decent tailwind, so we're going to want to keep that in mind too.
On landing, he's got about a 15
Fire
knot
traffic.
headwind.
Glider 85 Whiskey is ready for takeoff on 35 Nephi. So we land straight ahead.
So he's doing the call-outs Dan was just talking about.
And with all that land straight ahead, John, your canopy is closed, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do that pre-takeoff checklist every time.
Yep. I checked me, I did not check you. That's why I was just checking. We'd still be straight ahead.
He started at about 5,000 feet. He's going to do the rope toe break
Okay.
a little over 200 feet.
Keep my airspeed.
That was
Go
it.
back for the runway. Airspeed. Gotta put the nose down for airspeed.
It's kind of a mind thing, you know. Don't overturn it.
A little coaching from the flight instructor there.
Okay.
Hey, start your angle
You wanna
back.
get down. Now I'm going to get some pretty good ground rush because of the.
Now he's pretty fast and pretty hot, but on a sailplane you've got really good drag control
I guess
with
the
spoilers
reason
that come
why
up in the
we still have
wings.
3,000 feet to go.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
So I just wanted to get us down to the end of the runway.
So Another really nice feature having on an aircraft when you're doing this is if you are climbing a headwind and you make the turn back, you can end up over the runway going fast because it's a downwind, right? If you've got much of a headwind, you're going to have a lot faster ground speed, and you can end up high because the turn radius was tighter as you made the turn. So it's really nice, like if you're flying a Mooney, for example, it's really nice to be able to generate a lot of drag so that you get down quick. And a Mooney, that's hard to do, right? You're going to have to either slip it. You know, we always say the flaps in the Mooney are good for just bringing the nose down so you can see over to land. So you know, you want to be able to slip the aircraft or have you know, the great old barn door Cessna flaps are fantastic, right? You can put those down, it'll come down like a banshee. It's an easy maneuver in the Pegasus Air because it has a very, very good climb rate, so it's easy to get high enough to do the maneuver. It's also got excellent low-speed handling characteristics, so it's easy to make a tight turn and come back. And if I'm too high, and I did have an emergency once coming out of here, where my turbocharger malfunctioned, the engine started detonating, and so I had to pull the power off. But I had climbed like a banshee, not anticipating this at all, but climbed like a banshee out of here just because it's fun. And I made the turn, and I was 800 feet over the end of the runway when I finished the turn. And so it was really nice to have the flaps and drag to get down, slip it, and get back down to the runway. So I wasn't quite 800, probably more like 600. Ingredients for a successful turn back. So here's 3 basic ingredients. Number 1, you have to be proficient as a pilot. And you have to have trained to do this, and you have to have periodically practiced it. And the higher the performance of the aircraft, the more important that really is. You have to reach a minimum turn back altitude. If you don't hit the altitude that's necessary to make a 360 degree, it really turns out it's not a 180 degree turn, right? Because usually when you make a 180 degree turn, just like you saw with those other ones, you're offset from the runway on the way back. So you have to angle back in. Now there's a couple ways that people teach that. One is to make a 270 degree turn and then fly a diagonal back in and then complete that with, there's a point on the turn radius where you can make a 45 degree, continue the turn past 180, 45 degrees. I guess 45 plus 180 is 225. And then you angle back to the airport and you make another 45. That's one way to do it. And it depends on how far you are from the runway. The other one is you make a 270 back, and then as you approach the airport, you make a 90 back. So there's a couple different ways to do that. But you need the altitude to be able to do that. If you don't have the altitude, this isn't an option for you. I said it right off the bat. All you're going to do is crash in a turn somewhere off the runway if you don't have the altitude to do this. So it's key to know what your minimum turn back altitude is. And then the last thing is your climb angle needs to be greater than your glide angle if after the departure from the runway you want to be able to make it back. So let's say you have an engine failure just off the end of the runway, but you've got turn back altitude. You can go ahead and make a turn back, and when you complete that turn, you're going to be touching down pretty much where you started, maybe a little beyond it. If you've flown a mile off the end of the runway and your engine fails and your climb angle has been steeper than your return glide angle, you'll have plenty of altitude to make the turn out there. You'll lose the altitude in the turn back out there, but you'll still end up higher than your glide angle when you come back. But if you're on the other side of that, if your climb angle is lower than your glide angle, once you get beyond the runway, say you had enough altitude at the end of the runway to make the turn back, you're starting to lose any margin you had as you go out because you did not climb as fast as your glide, so you're just not going to be able to get back if you do that. So that's really, really important to know. And at sea level, this is an issue where things are oftentimes very feasible because the climb rates are better than the glide angles at sea level on a lot of aircraft. Up here, unless it's turbocharged, it's pretty hard to climb faster at a steeper angle than you can glide.
And just for point of numbers, Cessna 172, 60 knots, 10 to 1 glide ratio, say, which is that's a 6 knot down driver. glide speed. Well, that's 600 feet a minute. So
You're saying your descent rate would be 6 knots.
600 feet a minute, the best glide,
Right.
10 to 1, and that's, optimistic for what's up to. This morning we took off, and 500 feet a minute, climb rate. So 172 out of here, just me, calm, cool. I was pretty much in standard conditions. Wouldn't make it.
Right, yeah. I wouldn't make it out of here in the Bonanza, even light. I can't do it out of here. Even in Espanola, it needs to be a very cold day with just me and quarter tanks, and then I can do it.
Did you say you wouldn't have made it?
Nope.
And that was at 500 feet.
Yeah, so I basically, and frankly, 172 is probably about 9 to 1, so it's probably 650 to 700 feet a minute descent rate.
Okay.
And you're not going to ever get that.
It's not recommended in the manual at all.
No, I think one thing, we really shouldn't be talking about the turn back, because like those guys that survived that crash, they tried to make the runway. If they had just landed in the dirt next to the trees, they might have got a little flatter.
They could have potentially, but
So
I think they were pretty much out of airspeed all the way
but
down.
I think what we should be thinking as pilots is not turning back the runway, but going somewhere where you can crash elegantly. And that literally is going to change every second. And I think that's, and you have to know, I mean, it's brilliant. You should know in your head, to make a 360, best case scenario, I'm going to lose so many feet. Go out and fly that airplane. And then that way you know, oh, I only need to make 180 to make that thing. You can calculate in 2 seconds what your real options are for your engineering.
John, you were going to say, hang on just a second, Andrew.
So it seems like that is a pretty good argument for taking off at VX, at least for the first part of your climb out. Is that a fair conclusion?
So this is where that comment about, it's airspeed is like money in your pocket, altitude is money in the bank. What happens is, I've thought about this a lot, and so now I'm going to give you an opinion, okay? My opinion is I'd rather have the airspeed that VY gives me on the climb out than the climb angle that I get with VX. Now this will vary from plane to plane, but I would rather have that. And the reason is, you see in that mooning when the stall horn went off? I mean, the engine made that terrible noise, and the stall horn went off almost immediately. So my guess is he was very close to VX when he was climbing out, and that airplane just started decelerating really quick. VY is really the most efficient airspeed to be at. You're not going to decelerate as quick, and you'll have some money in your pocket. Andrew?
I was just going to add that, like, when training this stuff, dead stick versus idle engine is different. Slightly. So that's like a thing to consider.
That's an excellent point. In fact, I'm going to give you a way to calculate very simply what your to estimate your turnback altitude. But it's very fallacious. It's a fallacy to assume that an idling engine that's running is going to give you that you're going to have the same glide ratio you're going to have with a dead engine. And a good example is if your RPM is more than a couple hundred RPM at idle, you're generating thrust. In my Bonanza, when I fire up my Bonanza and I pull it back to idle, when it's cold, it'll idle about 600 RPM or so. If I take my foot off the brakes, it'll start creeping. So that's a pretty substantial, help in an emergency. So if you're going to go do that, and I was going to talk about this later, but I'll talk about that. If you're going to go do this experimentally, unless you're going to kill the engine, which I don't recommend unless you're experienced with that, and if you do that, make sure you have plenty of altitude. When you pull that back to idle, you're not going to, your glide rate, typically the number people talk about is between 15 and 20% improvement with an idling engine compared to a dead engine. So you should add 15 to 20% to your altitude. Any others? Roger.
Yeah, every once in a while I remind myself that if the engine quits and I have to do this turn back, the insurance company owns the airplane and I have to save myself, not the airplane.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder. But you know what? I got to tell you, it's the end of this. I'm going to talk about psychological biases. You've spent 5 years and all your gold building this airplane. And an experienced pilot like you in his head can say, the insurance company can own that. You know, my family's more important. But not everybody has that kind of mental.
I like building.
Crash the build, is
In fact, you got to bias your brain. So let me keep going. Huh? Am I doing okay? I'm not doing too bad. Okay, brand new pilot, just passed his check ride, private pilot check ride. Has the skills to do this maneuver. You're required to do 45-degree steep turn, plus or minus 5 degrees, plus or minus 10 knots. That's what you need to do in this maneuver. You're taught how to do an emergency descent. 30 to 45-degree bank angle, speed plus 0, minus 10 knots. You have to do that now as a private pilot. And so we're doing a turning descent. You have to be able to demonstrate a short field approach. Maintain the manufacturer's published airspeed, or in absence of that, about 1.3 stall speed, plus 10, minus 5 knots. So you've got to be able to put the airplane down at something close to best glide. Now, what's missing in any of these, it depends on how you do the emergency descent, but what's missing in any of these is the ground rush, because you're doing it, usually when you do these other maneuvers, it's at altitude, right? There is a very distinct ground rush. When you at a 45-degree bank angle, your descent rate will, in the glide alone, will increase by over 20% in the glide. And when you're close to the ground, it looks like things are moving a lot faster than when you're 1,000 feet above the ground. And so that was the biggest thing I remember the first time I did this. And actually, I didn't try this until I was working on my CFI certificate. Is how quickly it doesn't look like you're going to make it initially if you're at the minimum altitude in that turn. You remember the glider pilot, the instructor saying, get the nose down, get the nose down? Well, the natural reaction when the ground's coming up, you don't want to beat it, right? And you pull back. You just got to have done it, trust the numbers, and you'll get around. And as soon as you come out of that and you level, everything flattens out. The whole glide and everything flattens out. So, instruction, practice, and turnback maneuver is absolutely important. But I think a private pilot that just passed his check ride could do this. Very, very quickly learn to do this. Okay, it's all about altitude. You have to have enough altitude or energy to be able to do this. In a normal takeoff, you typically don't have both, so this goes back to John's question about climbing out at VX. I've decided VY I'd rather have that extra airspeed. But sometimes you can have too much, like we talked about, like in a STOL aircraft with a steep climb capability. You lose the engine, all of a sudden you're really high and you got to get back. And you got to get down. Okay, you got to know what this minimum turnback altitude is, and you can estimate that for standard conditions. Okay, this is based on standard conditions. I'll talk a little bit about density, altitude, and aircraft weight later on. But for standard conditions, you've got to be able to do a 360-degree turn with a 45-degree bank. The descent rate will be about 20% higher in the turn. This will be flown at best glide speed. And there will be some response turn in a real scenario, right? You're going to get surprised. And you're going to wonder usually the stall horn will get your attention. That's when you'll put the nose down. But if you're prepped for this on takeoff, like Dan was talking about, thinking about when you go out of here, if you're prepped and thinking about this could happen, you'll respond almost immediately when you lose that engine. And but if you're not, you're flying on a trip and you're thinking about the trip and you have an engine failure, the FAA recommends, and other people, a 3-second response time where you're keeping that attitude that you're using on takeoff, and your speed will decay very rapidly when you do that. So making those assumptions with using these formulas, You can calculate the turn radius, you can calculate the turn rate, and you can calculate the descent rate. I came up with this is an approximation, right? Don't bet the farm on this number, but it will tell you for the particular aircraft you're flying in, kind of what the number is going to be, okay? So if you take Vy, your best rate of climb speed, and you square it, you multiply by it times itself, and then you divide by the glide ratio, that will give you
At Vy?
Thank you. The glide, you want to fly best glide when you do this, but use Vy because that's an easy number to get out of the POH, okay? And it will give you a little margin, and so that's why, these all are using Vy for their calculations in here. So I chose to use Vy in this. You could do the same thing at best glide, and you'd get a slightly lower turn altitude because you'd be making the turn slower, be a tighter radius. But Vy gives you just a little bit of margin.
But using the glide ratio at Vy or the best glide ratio?
The best glide ratio. So let me comment on this for a second. So I don't know how many of you remember this, but when you've got the engine running, you're going to have let's see, how do I put this? Vy in a climb, well, your best rate of climb will be better than your best glide speed, right? Typically, it'll be about 10% higher. And the reason is the engine is actually, because you're in a climb and the engine's giving you thrust, you have a slightly higher thrust vector. So you can actually have a more efficient climb at Vy than you would have at Vx or something like that. Oftentimes, best glide is closer to Vx, which is slightly slower. So if you look in your manual, it will give you, right off the bat, Vy. That's one of the speeds that you see. You have to usually dig a lot deeper. In an older aircraft, it's very difficult sometimes to find what is your best glide speed. But if you know Vy and you multiply that by 0.9, you'll be pretty close to your best glide speed. I know that's probably a mouthful, but in this calculation, plug in Vy, and it gives you some margin. All right, so I'll give you some examples here. Okay, I already talked about the climb angle and the 60 glide angle. Let me go back for just a second here. So, let's calculate these guys. Okay, so in the glider, you can see 60 knots, right? So that's 3,600. If you square it, 60 times 60 is 3,600. It's got a 36-to-1 glide ratio. If you divide 36, which is the glide ratio, into 3,600, you get 100 feet. So they're doing the rope break at 200 feet. But in theory, if everything was right, they could do it as low as 100 feet. And we could see in the demonstration, the guy was pulling in his spoilers as he came back and saw the runway. He saw he was going to be high. And then over the runway, he's pulling in his spoilers, so there's altitude. So it's an easy calculation to do. In my Pegasus Air, I've done it at 400 feet. And if you do the calculation, my minimum turn attitude is 450 feet. So gliders, you can do it really low, right? You don't need a lot of altitude in a sailplane. In a low-speed aircraft like a Pegasus Air or a Cub or a Taylorcraft or Taylorcraft, again, you've got low speeds, pretty good glide rate. Skip, you could probably do one. I don't know. Do you know what your Vy is in a Taylorcraft?
Not really. I tend to use 55 miles an hour.
55 miles an hour.
That's what I found.
Yeah, so that's even lower than mine.
And when I've practiced this, I found that I can actually make the turn back at altitude in right around 300 feet, depending on which bank angle I'm using. I've tried standard rate turns in 45 degree and so forth. But about 300 feet. And so my standard thing on takeoff in the Taylorcraft at this point, when I hit 7,500 feet at the end of the runway, that's one of my call-out points, if I could turn at that point.
Yeah, good. Another good data point. You should be able to do it at a lower altitude than I can do in the PEG because you have a lower turning speed. It's going to keep you in tighter. And you also have a great glide ratio on
It's
the
a slower
Chapter.
airplane.
Yeah. So what does it look like for Bonanza? 1,100 feet. So it's high performance everything. Oh man, it's high performance in a turn back. No, I need 1,100 feet. I don't even think about a turn back if I don't have 1,100 feet. Because I won't make it. Because at 105, I'm making this giant turn. Because the turn radius goes as the square of your speed. So, you know, Skip, it's 55 miles an hour. And me at, let's see, what is it, about 125 miles an hour. You know, I'm like 2.5 times, right? And you square that, and that's like 6 times the turn radius. So I'm out there watching the whole countryside going by. Now I'm still in a 45-degree bank, and I'm still coming down like a banshee, but I'm way the heck out there. So you need more altitude in airplanes with higher glide speeds and lower glide ratios. Okay, so here's the rules I use. Below TBA is turn back altitude. TBA, turn back altitude. Below turn back altitude, I'm just going straight ahead. Or slight variations, right, to find the best field or something like that. You know, so I'm watching my altitude when I climb out. If I'm below that, I have no decision. I can make the decision on the ground, right? Until I get this altitude, I'm not even thinking about it. I'm going to go straight ahead. It simplifies things a great deal. Above TPA and over the runway, I can make the turn back, and I'll probably land on the runway again, if that is the best option, right? There is some more risk in making a maneuver like this close to the ground than to just kind of gliding into a field someplace, right? So, but at least I have the option to decide if I can do it. Above TBA, but beyond the runway, I'm not going to turn back unless I know that my climb angle is greater than my glide angle. And you can tell that, you know, once you fly, you get a pretty good feel, and you can look it up in the POH and figure out those angles. They're easy to calculate too. If you're going to make a turn back, generally it's recommended turn into the wind. So if you've got a crosswind, like we have here, you've got a crosswind coming in, what you typically want to do, unless there's a better option, you know, another runway that's the opposite the wind or something like that, what you want to do is turn into the wind, because what's going to happen is you turn into the wind, you're going to run into a headwind. So you're not going to go out as far away from the runway. Your ground speed's going to slow down, and it'll keep you closer to the ground. So, you know, in an emergency, unless you know a better option, you want to go to a different runway, always turn into the wind to keep you closer.
In the glider business, on the ground.
Oh, we have another glider pilot. That's right, Gary.
On the ground, first thing you do before you take off is, where's the wind coming from? Which way am I going to turn? You learn that, you do that before you ever take off.
You know, this is what's really cool having you guys here, is that as glider pilots, you're thinking about making a landing without an engine all the time. And if power, like Dan said, oh, I got a little pressure, you know, got RPM, I'm good to go. If you thought like that, I bet you we'd see the accident rates go way down if you thought like glider pilots.
And all of us that are flying these 70-year-old airplanes, we basically are flying gliders.
Or if you're flying an ultralight with a 2-stroke engine, you got to think this way too. Okay, so things that can impact this, and I just, you know, so this isn't, I've made it sound pretty clean, but it can be affected by density altitude big time. A good example is that, you know, I'll take my Bonanza. Let me do this one first. Density altitude. Out of the airport here, on a, you know, a normal summer afternoon or something like that, my true airspeed will be 105 knots, but because of density altitude, my ground speed will be 125 knots. And we already talked about how quickly that can make the turn diameter a lot bigger. So, you know, high density altitude, you're going to have to add some factor to that minimum turn back altitude to account for it. weight of the aircraft makes a significant difference. You can see here again, your glide speed is going to vary with the weight of the aircraft, right? The published glide speed is at gross weight. So if you're flying your airplane light, let's say you weigh 80% of your gross weight, your best glide speed will drop by 10%. So think about that. That's the speed you really want to fly, is that speed. And your turn radius will decrease by 20%. So it can make a substantial difference if you're flying, the airplane light, and it's worth thinking about. Let's see. Okay, you want to see one I didn't make back? I'll show you a video here real quick. It shows you how fast things happen too. Let's see what I gotta do here.
So when we're setting it up, we make another comment. We often say we're gonna go knock the rust off and go fly. And what I do when I'm doing that is I measure. So I recommend.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. I just recommend when you fly, do these sort of things. The theory's great, but go get in your airplane and see how well you're able to hit these speeds. It's so easy to do a 360-degree turn at you think the best speed and measure that altitude. You should have those numbers in your head all the time. And so don't go, oh, I'm going to go to Santa Fe and do some touch and goes. Fine. But then also do something that actually puts data in your head about how well your airplane is, because it may not be in rig as it was when it left the factory, blah, 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 blah. The data is really way more important than the theory of this stuff, and it improves your proficiency.
Yeah, I would say it a little differently, but they'd be the same way. Is the data gives you guidance. The experiment tells you what it's really going to do. So the data, you can see trends and what you should do and what you shouldn't do. But if you want the number, go do the experiment. Okay, so this is in the Pegasus Air when I was practicing, and I kept dropping my altitudes lower and lower. And this one, what happened in this one was I wanted to see how about if I had the failure farther out. And so what I did was I climbed to 450 feet, but then I extended it well past the end of the runway. And I held that altitude. I didn't just keep climbing. I just held it. I thought, okay, well, how much margin have I really got in this number that I generated? So you're going to see I'm flying by it. So the camera is on the tip of the wingtip on the Pegasus Air, looking forward. This is the county facilities right there, and I'm just about to the end of the runway right now. I'm now going to fly beyond it in about 20 seconds or so. And this is kind of loud, so I'm just going to play it. That's the wind noise. See the nose dropping? I simulated the power. You can't hear it because of the wind noise. Notice the pitch changed down. A little steeper than 45 degrees. So I come around, I look at the runway and I say, crap, I'm almost below it already. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go for the emergency field. See how fast everything's happening?
That field looks really good.
You didn't want to see what came next.
I don't think it looks like that in real life.
It needs to be mowed, right? But, so...
And that's at 50 miles an hour, imagine that.
No, that's at 60 knots.
60 knots.
60 knots, yeah. So, so it was, the whole thing was only 45 seconds, right? So things are happening really quick. I did not land in this one. I went around in this particular one. I had landed in that field before, and in the Pegasus Air, it's very doable to land and take off there. But in the Bonanza, it would be tight, really tight. It's only 1,700 feet long.
How many people have been to the Strip in the last year?
Not in an airplane.
No, I mean hiking. I think that's another really good psychological thing. I was down there last week, and because is it in play or not, right? You know, it's probably not in play for the venture.
Oh, no.
Right? And
Yeah.
it's maybe not in play for the bonanza.
Yeah, it depends. And the Bonanza's easier.
So
You know,
I think
I'd think about it if I was in the right position on the downwind, you know, because you're on the
right. I
downwind.
think for each of us, it's worth it to go down there and go, is this really in play for me? Because that's part of your deal as your call out. It's like, you're not going to think about it in the venture, so it's not in your...
Right, I don't even think about it, right.
Skip, it's in his, probably in your deal right away, but everything in the middle, you've got two extremes here, right? But in 172 and in the Cherokee space...
I think you could do it. Yeah.
But I think each of us should, you know, that's a...
Yeah, think about that. I mean, those airplanes land slow and,
Right.
yeah.
And another factor here at Los Alamos is, take off from here and tell me what your other options are.
Well, exactly right. Yeah, you've got 30 seconds, maybe a minute of where maybe there's no plan, right? It's just, you're gonna be, oh crap, you know, if you don't have a sheet on.
Also, I think just to piggyback on what Dan is saying, is like, go physically to, like, these places where when you're flying and you look down, you're like, oh, I can land there. Like, go physically there on your feet, drive your car there, and then make that decision, because I would guess 7 out of 10 times you'd be like, oh, just kidding. That's not a good option to
Typically
land.
10 times as worse as you think.
Right.
The rock sizes are typically...
Yep, they're big.
Yeah.
Mark, you were
Well, I was
saying-
gonna say, on Google Earth, you can inspect the field and actually measure the dimensions, 600 feet, whatever.
Well, I think I remember a talk I gave in the Cub where you could, you put the tape on, and I think everybody should use it. You put tape on the plane where that's below your glide ratio, and well, you can't bank. And the nice thing with the Cub, the distance from the jury strokes is your altitude. So you can measure in real time, make them wrong.
Yeah, ankles are good. Ankles are good. The thing I noticed when I landed this in the field down there more than anything in the peg was the field is sloped side to side. And as I touched down on the mains, in a wheel landing, I had to crab almost 30 degrees to keep from sliding down the hill off the right side because of that slip to it. So, okay, last slide. Turnback psychology. Given the following choices, a known risk of injury and certain loss, but possible survivability, or an unknown risk with potentially no loss or injury that might be fatal, which one would you pick? Human nature tends to go with the latter. We believe in hope. And that's not the way you want to do this, okay? That's, we do so well as a species because we have this rational brain, right? The rational brain is, what altitude do I need to do this, and what are my checkpoints to decide if I can do it? And you can do all that on the ground ahead of time. So you don't have to make that decision in the air, and that will save you time. So that's it.